we are a few weeks before presidential elections. Whether we call that elections is another question, a ballot. I will not ask you about the probability of Vladimir Putin winning, because that's not really an interesting question. The interesting question is, how will his another term actually shift foreign policy dynamics? What does another term for Putin imply? On the one hand, domestically for Russia, its self-perception, but then on the other hand, for us Europeans who are living on the borders of Russia.
I was hoping you would ask about Putin's re-election and the probability. For once,
Go
I
ahead.
could actually predict something with reasonable degree of certainty. So I'm sad you took that away. Look, there's been, obviously, to state the obvious, there's been very little campaign in Russia, because this is in keeping with President Putin's desire to have less of a political contest and more of a reconfirmation, if you will. Therefore, there hasn't been much of a debate really on foreign policy. You have seen attempts by Zhenya Sobchak to start one by actually questioning whether the annexation of Crimea was legal. The statement in itself could be prosecutable, as you know, under the Russian law. The authorities decided not to. But by and large, there has been very little debate in the Russian in the Russian presidential election on foreign policy, because there's been very little campaign in the first place, and that's very unlikely to change because of the domination of the president by the president of the media and of the political space, and because the main real challenger, Navalny, the real difference between him and president, of course, are not in the foreign policy domain. They lie on the issues of corruption, the economic issues, but mainly corruption. And of course, the path Navalny has chosen sensibly and wisely, I think, cleverly, let me put it this way, is one of not contesting the elections, but actually trying to drive down the president's legitimacy by turning and encouraging people not to turn out at the elections. Let me make a somewhat more interesting point, though, perhaps, than the sort of the mechanics of the election, which is that quietly something else and interesting has been happening in Russia, and that actually predates the presidential elections in the first place. Let me wind back a little bit. In 2014, when the invasion of eastern Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea happened, the conventional wisdom among most Russia watchers, certainly the conventional wisdom in most of the intelligence at NATO at the time, was that having chosen to define his legitimacy on the basis of returning greatness and perhaps former lands to Russia, as opposed to economic issues and living standards, President Putin will now have no choice but to stay in this confrontation with the West and perhaps go in the search of ever newer adventures and conflicts to pick with us as he seeks to reconfirm his or boost his legitimacy. The idea was that in a context between the fridge and the television, if you know the analogy, refrigerator issues being the ones on sort of your income and your quality of life, TV issues being, of course, nationalism and language rights and Ruski Mir. The television has won. Putin is now going to be the television president. Nobody cares about living standards. Returning the sense of dignity is the thing to go. And the worry among Western analysts was that we're in for a roller coaster, that once the Crimea effect expires, he'll be looking for newer conflicts to keep justifying his legitimacy. That hasn't happened.
Does it mean it won't happen?
Well, for now the trends are heading the opposite way. The president hasn't really, of course, changed his view on Ukraine or on the West. The tone and the substance of the policies remains the same. He changed the subject. When you listen to the debates, when you listen to the speeches, the long telethon marathons that he does with the public, he has actually quietly shifted the debate back to domestic issues. When I ask my friends in Moscow, when I travel there, ask why, they tell me, look, he's been forced. In a sense that the public opinion and focus groups, pollsters, when you speak to Levada, the polling center that many of you will be familiar with, they all tell you one thing. Russian public has gotten a bit tired of the idea of overextension. They are not unlike Western publics, not unlike the US public, a bit tired of having overextended the military muscle. They want less foreign intervention. They want a bit less foreign adventurism. They want more focus on domestic issues. And Putin, in his own way, isn't completely unresponsive to popular demand.
And is Putin capable of managing domestic issues, living standards, and the domestic economy in a way which would produce more growth and more equality? Or are we at risk of a situation which classically leads to war, where a leader is incapable of providing that kind of social and economic security and actually decides to go for?
Excellent questions, because of course the shift...
Now put the country name you want in.
I won't. And I'll be brief, but it's an excellent question, because of course the shift from sort of foreign policy issues, the Syrias of these worlds, back to domestic issues, which the president has undergone, puts him in an uncomfortable role. Because every economist of any respect or any reputation will tell you that in order to really improve the living standards and really improve the economy, you've got to diversify away from the oil and gas. You do have to obviously introduce a stronger rule of law, otherwise you'll never attract the investors and so forth. And these are all things that the president is probably not capable of delivering, for the simple reason that once you give the courts the right and the freedom to properly adjudicate on commercial issues, you know, they will eventually start to actually adjudicate on political issues, and then that's a slippery slope from the point of view of someone who runs a fairly centralized political system with all kinds of informal, possibly illegal checks and balances. So the president is now in an uncomfortable position. He's in a very comfortable lead in the elections, but in an uncomfortable position of, if you will, having shifted the public debate onto issues where he has no good answers, and they will show up over time. So the subtone in your question, is there a possibility that we will see a return to a more nationalistic tone and a tone of confrontation? The only honest answer intellectually is I can't rule it out, because I can see the pitfalls of having switched the topics to domestic political issues. On those, he isn't strong, he's short of the answers. He has far more ability to deliver results, if you will, in foreign policy or military domains.
So a question to you for a number also, in terms of probabilities. In a 10-year time frame, how high would you rate the risk of Russia invading a NATO member state?
I am not even going to give you a number, of course. I assume, and I think it's a very sensible and healthy assumption, that the deterrence policy we have put in place since 2014 is pretty robust. I mean, if you honestly ask me in 2014, back then I was an ambassador to NATO, whether I would ever see Germany and France agreeing with the forward deployment of foreign troops to Poland, the Baltic states, I would have said, no way. Germany is never going to agree. And now Germany is leading one of those battle groups, of course.
And a non-NATO member state adventure?
Look, I mean, what depends an awful lot on us is the honest answer. The lines of confrontation have now been and the reasons for confrontation have now been fairly clearly defined. What we see is, from the Russian side, is a pushback against the notion that states on its borders should have the rights and the freedom to choose their foreign policy affiliations. So an awful lot depends obviously on what happens in Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine itself.